in a cultural moment defined by algorithmic plenitude and the mechanized reproduction of form at an unprecedented scale, we find ourselves confronted with a peculiar and unsettling phenomenon: the gradual, almost imperceptible death of the object, not through violent rupture, nor via revolutionary critique, but rather through the slow attrition of significance in the face of infinite, indifferent generation. The object, once a site of concentrated meaning, whether functional, symbolic, or affective, has, across centuries of aesthetic sedimentation, played a central role in mediating between the human subject and the material world. It bore the dignity of use, the aura of ritual, or the authority of symbolic representation. But in the wake of postmodern irony, conceptual exhaustion, and most recently, the synthetic delirium of generative systems, the object has undergone a profound ontological deflation. The advent of generative art has not revitalized form, but rather exposed its hollow repetition. These systems, unconcerned with cultural lineage or intentionality, produce images at the velocity of code, enacting a promiscuous multiplication of quasi-objects, each resembling meaning without ever attaining it. Form is mimicked, mutated, iterated, and abandoned, all without consequence. And it is within this accelerating archive of unanchored artifacts that we begin to discern the spectral figure of the post-object. What we now encounter is not an artwork in the traditional sense, nor even a deconstruction of one, but the residual trace of objecthood. What remains after function, reference, and even irony have collapsed into a state of aesthetic entropy. The post-object emerges not as a negation, but as a remainder, a mute, affectively inert configuration of form that no longer strives to communicate, to serve, or to symbolize. It is an artifact without audience, a presence without ambition, a thing whose principal feature is its refusal to matter in any of the ways we have historically expected things to matter. To apprehend the post-object is to encounter a mode of form that resists not by subversion, but by withdrawal. It does not gesture, it does not signify, it merely persists, and in doing so, enacts a kind of radical passivity that undermines the ontological frameworks upon which both aesthetic and utilitarian value have long depended. These are not works that beg analysis or provoke discourse. They do not participate in any recognizable aesthetic economy. They are, in essence, forms that have survived their own relevance. As these engines of synthetic creativity continue to churn out objects at a scale beyond human apprehension, the meaningfulness of any singular instance begins to collapse under the weight of endless variation. In this context, the post-object is not a failure of imagination, but a natural consequence of algorithmic excess, a byproduct of creation unmoored from intention. It is this very absence of intentionality that lends the post-object its strange and uncanny effect. It does not desire interpretation. It does not even acknowledge the gaze. It stands apart from both content and critique. Unlike the avant-garde object, which often seeks to disrupt or scandalize, the post-object scandalizes through its refusal to engage at all. It is not apathy. It is a deeper kind of silence, a silence not of withdrawal, but of absolute disinterest. In its refusal to function, the post-object becomes a figure of aesthetic composting. It is neither symbolic nor purely formal. It does not offer a metaphor, nor does it achieve abstraction. It exists somewhere beneath both, an X-form, a hollowed proposition. One might say it is the memory of an object, processed through layers of generative indifference, and returned to us as something inert, yet inexplicably persistent. We may be tempted to call this the endpoint of form, but such a designation presumes a teleology the post-object no longer recognizes. What we are witnessing is not the death of the object, nor the birth of its successor, but the subtle drift of objecthood into an ontological twilight, an indefinite, unresolved state in which the very premise of objecthood becomes porous, equivocal, and ultimately unmoored from its historical predicates. To engage with the post-object is, therefore, not to seek comprehension, but to sit in quiet proximity to that which asks nothing of us. It is an invitation not to interpretation, but to cohabitation with form in its most fatigued and elemental state. It is perhaps the closest art has come to enacting the condition of being without meaning, a kind of existential weather in which objects cease to be signs and become simply traces of having been. And so, we are left with a form that no longer speaks, no longer signifies, and no longer seeks redemption through use or beauty. The post-object does not mark a crisis. It marks a settling, an ontological sedimentation, not the end of art, but the quiet persistence of its debris, not absence, but the dull presence of something that once mattered and now merely remains. This is not nothing. This is what is left when nothing attempts to become something and forgets why it ever wanted to. There is a peculiar moment, somewhere after the death of the avant-garde and before the rise of the content industrial complex, when art ceased to ask, "What does it mean?" and began instead to murmur, "Why bother?" It is in this space, this silted trench between intention and automation, that the post-object emerges. Not as a rebellion, not as a statement, but as a seepage, a remainder, a thing that exists not to be understood, but simply because something had to be rendered. We are, undeniably, living in the age of the post-object, a cultural epoch defined less by form than by failure. Failure to signify, failure to cohere, failure to mean. But to understand this age, we must begin with the corpse of its predecessor, post-irony. Post-irony, that decadent offspring of sincerity and satire, began as a mode of cultural critique, a means of navigating the hypersaturated absurdity of late capitalism, with a wink so weary it could be mistaken for nihilism. And yet, like all aesthetic modes metabolized by the feed, post-irony soon became indistinguishable from the thing it sought to mock. The critique became the product, the irony became the brand. What remained, in the wake of post-irony's collapse, was not a new sincerity, nor a redemptive authenticity, but a vacuous automatism, the endless production of content by systems that neither know nor care why they create. This is the era of AI slop, a phrase as vulgar as the phenomenon it describes. Images poured forth by generative engines, stitched together from scraped fragments of visual detritus, presented not as art, but as visual noise in search of purpose. The post-object thrives here, amid the slurry of partially rendered limbs, warped fingers, haunted teeth, and implausible architecture. Here, in the uncanny drizzle of prompt-derived artifacts, we find a new kind of object, not unfinished, but never meant to be finished. These are not failed artworks. They are successful errors, artifacts whose failure is baked into the system that produced them. The classical art object asked to be contemplated. The modernist object asked to be decoded. The postmodern object asked to be questioned. The post-object asks nothing. It is, in its purest form, a visual shrug, a gesture toward meaning that dissolves upon arrival, not because it is opaque or mysterious, but because it is fundamentally unmotivated. There is a haunting beauty in this unmotivated generation, a kind of degraded sublime. Not the sublime of Turner's Storms or Rothko's Voids, but the pixelated sublime of a machine attempting to render a hand, and producing instead a viscous cluster of fingers, multiplying like tumors. These are not grotesque by design, they are grotesque by procedure. And herein lies the ontological break. The post-object is not designed, it is generated. It is not created to express, to represent, or even to evoke. It is the byproduct of computation, form emergent from syntax, untethered from consciousness. And yet, we look at it. We search its warped contours for resonance. We mistake our own interpretive hunger for intention. The aesthetic of AI slop, then, is not merely bad art. It is not kitsch, nor camp, nor even parody. It is the visual field's equivalent of semantic satiation, an image that has been repeated until the notion of image itself begins to fray. What distinguishes the post-object from the artifact or the error is precisely its persistent undecidability. It resists even failure as a category. A corrupted file is broken, a glitch is accidental, but the post-object is neither. It is what happens when you ask a system to dream, and the system sleepwalks through its training data, assembling forms with the aimless fidelity of a sleep-deprived deity. In this way, the post-object becomes the patron saint of the feed, low resolution, temporally inert, endlessly replicable, and utterly without consequence. It does not disrupt the algorithm. It is the algorithm. And yet, perversely, we begin to aestheticize this detritus. We begin to curate failed generations, to elevate the uncanny as if it bore intention. And maybe that is the final irony, not post-irony, but post-meaning, a cultural condition in which we attribute depth not to presence, but to persistence. The post-object persists. That is all it does. And perhaps in a world so saturated with spectacle, so terminally overcoded with significance, this kind of mute endurance is the most radical gesture available to us. Not protest, not parody, not presence, just remainder. A thing that exists simply because something had to fill the space. A thing that could have been anything and ended up being this. This is not a failure of art. This is art after failure has become the medium. Welcome to the Museum of Never Meant to Be. Please do not interpret the objects. They are not looking back. There comes a point in the cultural metabolism, somewhere beyond repetition's exhaustion, past irony's implosion, and beneath the sediment of formalism's final gasp, when form no longer signals, no longer questions, and no longer desires to be included in any dialectical economy of gesture and counter-gesture. And what emerges in its stead is not absence, not negation, not critique, but a kind of passive material remainder. An object not so much made as precipitated, not conceived, but sedimented. An echo without origin, which we might now begin to call, with all the solemnity of an unrequested taxonomy, the post-object. Not the minimalist object of intentional void, nor the conceptual object of critical proposition, nor even the glitch as accident, that romantic residue of disruption, but something far more inert, more sedimented in its ontology. Something produced not despite its lack of meaning, but because meaning is no longer part of the equation. An artifact of generative processes unburdened by narrative, by history, by intention, by gaze. Generated not in the sense of created, but in the sense that a rock is shaped by wind and time, or dust settles in a room long abandoned by thought. To speak of AI slop, that vulgar yet perversely precise term for the relentless, low-resolution, edge-warped debris extruded by neural engines trained on the flotsam of culture, is to confront not merely a quality problem or an aesthetic error, but to observe the rise of a new ontological class of image, one that hovers between artifact and mistake, between execution and hallucination, never quite coalescing into critique, parody, or even failure, but remaining suspended in a kind of procedural limbo, wherein every generation is simultaneously too much and not enough, overly determined, yet utterly empty, a performance of form that never reaches performance as such, and which therefore cannot be said to succeed, nor to fail, nor even to exist as an object in the classical sense. This, then, is the condition of the post-object, It is what remains after objecthood has passed through irony, through sincerity, through critique, through automation, through excess, and finally into a kind of inertial stasis, an ontological slush of fragments and form memories, where the index of intention has been replaced by the trace of repetition, and where nothing points to anything except the system that produced it, a system that no longer distinguishes between signal and noise because it no longer knows what it means to mean. Whereas the avant-garde sought to rupture, to destabilize, to interrogate the gaze or the gallery or the apparatus of value production, the post-object does not rupture, does not destabilize, does not interrogate. It simply persists, not with the obstinacy of critique, but with the apathy of inertia, offering nothing but the fact of its presence, or rather, its failure to fully disappear. One does not read the post-object, one drifts beside it, as one might drift beside flotsam on a polluted shoreline, not appraising its composition or questioning its metaphor, but merely noting its refusal to be ignored and its simultaneous refusal to matter, its unplaceability within the hierarchies of aesthetic judgment or cultural legibility, which is not a form of protest, but a kind of ambient indifference, as if the object were not speaking, but humming quietly in a frequency so low and so constant, it ceases to register as anything other than the background noise of a culture, too exhausted to filter signal from slop. In the generative field, where data becomes gesture through a calculus of probability and approximation, and where output precedes intention by design, the post-object thrives not as a mutation, nor as a failure, but as the natural consequence of a system in which everything is equally likely, equally plausible, and equally devoid of necessity, in which the image exists only because it was possible, and not because it was needed, asked for, or even noticed. Indeed, the post-object is not noticed in the way a painting or sculpture is noticed. It is encountered incidentally in the scroll, the glut, the cache, the discard pile, its presence not marked by significance, but by surplus. A surplus so totalizing that meaning itself becomes indistinguishable from mass, from volume, from the sheer weight of undifferentiated visuality piling upon itself in endless, frictionless iteration. And if one is tempted to interpret, to lend these forms the dignity of reference, the gravitas of metaphor, the soft halo of intention, one finds quickly that the gesture collapses, for there is nothing to grasp but the fact that this object exists solely because a prompt was submitted, a latent space traversed, and a probability collapsed, not a decision, but an occurrence. This is not the death of the object, nor its rebirth, but the object's slow geological drift into noise, into a field where legibility is neither required nor resisted, and where what once aspired to presence now settles into a kind of melancholic non-eventfulness, a presence without assertion, a trace without rupture. And so we drift, not in front of art, but among its byproducts, no longer curators of meaning, but scavengers of coherence, seeking in each generation the echo of intention that might never have been there, and learning, slowly, that perhaps the most honest image we can produce is not the one that speaks, but the one that simply appears, uninvited, unremarked, unrequired. An object, yes, but only just output, just slop, just something that had to fill the space.